Well, here we are. The first installment of the AP Euro Film Festival. And it's appropriate that a film festival celebrating an artistic milieu is first put into play dealing with an artistic movement, at least in part, the Romantic movement. And we're going to be talking about that in the clips dealing with Unit 6, Assignment 12. Again, we're not going to be able to devote time to this in class because of the weather days that we've missed. So it would be really in your best interest to do the reading in the book along with Assignment 12 very thoroughly, plus take a listen and gander at these clips. Not that seeing anything is going to make any difference, but so that you get a good grounding in what's going on with Romanticism. What we're going to do is we'll go through, and I'll probably break this up into a couple of segments, which will be clearly labeled on Edline, of course, and talk about it, this movement, Romanticism. We're going to start by talking about just the basics, an overview and some of the general characteristics of the Romantic movement and of Romanticism in general. First off, if you can put a chronological set of parameters on the Romantic era, it would be roughly from about 1780 to about 1830, so a 50-year period spanning the end of the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century. The peak of the movement, it really depends what country you're talking about, but the peak of the movement generally considered to be somewhere between 1815 and 1830. Then there's the question, was there really a real Romantic movement? Well, that's a good question. To think of it as monolithic, that's illusory. It's not going to happen if you go about it that way. The Romantic movement really varied from country to country. So each country's Romantic literature and art, etc., music, all has its own unique characteristics. A lot of times Romantics from different countries were more tied together by what they didn't like rather than what they liked. One really solid way to look at Romanticism is that it's really a reaction against the Enlightenment of the 18th century. In particular, it was coming out against the Enlightenment emphasis on that which was rational and purely logical, against neoclassicism in the arts, poetry, prose, all that stuff. And as we've talked about earlier in the year, neoclassicism, very, very hidebound by particular sets of rules that had to be followed for a given work of art or a piece of literature or a piece of music. And that particular work had to closely adhere to these set of guidelines of rules for that particular mode of artistic expression. The Romantics said, heck with the rules, throw them out. They're too confining. They're too narrow. Okay? They're too unimaginative. And one of the things that the Romantics want to bring back into the artistic and literary world is imaginative work and use of the creative imagination. And they also, it also extended into the political realm and history. Definitely, the Romantics really were really keen on history for reasons that'll become apparent soon. And also even into areas like science. They also looked at the Enlightenment thinkers and said they were way too optimistic. They were way too optimistic about especially the perfectibility of human beings. That they said, human beings are flawed by their very nature. They can't be perfected. There is no such thing as human perfectibility. And they said that's okay. That's okay because you can also get enjoyment and artistic satisfaction out of the grotesque and the irrational, the disorganized, and a lot of times that stuff's more interesting. So, in terms of religion, they said, yes, there was a God, and where you went to find God was nature, not science. The world around it, it's suffused in nature. In many ways, and you may remember this from talking about it last year in U.S. history, the transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were the descendants of the European Romantics. In many ways, transcendentalism is the American sort of sub-branch of Romanticism. So you find God in nature. So it's a back to nature movement. Okay. And instead of the Enlightenment and going into the French Revolution period's desire to break starkly from the past, the Romantics, they kind of had a pretty strong sense of emotional ties to the past. And they said, the past was important. It provided a sense of the ties with the past, a sense of continuity in human endeavor, and a sense of stability, which is why, a writer like Edmund Burke, back in his 1790 Reflections on the Revolution in France, really had a lot in common with some of the Romantic, and in fact, one of his earlier works was an early work in the Romantic vein called is about the nature of the sublime. What is it when something's sublime? Why it's awesome and terrifying at the same time. It's like you're cowed over by something that's such beauty, it's almost overawing, etc. Other thing, reason's important to the Romantics. No doubt about that, but what's equally important is intuition. Again, connection with the American Romantics, Ralph Waldo Emerson especially. And really, the Romantics said the human intellect took its guidance and instruction from intuition and from the emotive side. So, whereas Enlightenment thinkers tended to put the value and stress on humanity's rational faculties, on the head, the Romantics said, let's bring back in the emotive and the intuitive, the heart. Let's not throw the head out, but let's put it back into proper balance with the heart. So that's sort of the basics. Some other points of emphasis for the Romantics. On the one hand, they like to glory in the uniqueness of the individual, and therefore, with that emphasis on individualism, they did have some ties to early 19th century liberal thought with its concern for individual rights and individual ownership of private property and what have you. They also took a keen interest in the historical evolution of communities of people, of groups of people, and how different cultures developed. In that sense, there's some very close ties to nationalism, and those ties will become evident as we go on a little bit as well. Now, with history is important. They're very fascinated with the past, but they broadened the study of history just from narrow focus on politics to a more what we call today cultural history, to try to achieve a broader understanding of the past and human actions and motivations in the past. So they're not necessarily looking just for political and economic causes and effects and things like that. They're looking for a much richer tapestry of human history. Interesting thing, though, they generally, even though they tended to be somewhat liberal, they generally did not support republicanism. They liked the traditional institutions of your sort of national church and fighting for country and king. So they tended to be more appreciative of the benefits, so to speak, of monarchy. Okay, so those are sort of some more of the general emphases that the Romantics placed on and what they valued as important. They also were revolutionary in the sense of breaking with the immediate past artistic, literary, intellectual traditions. They didn't like the standards and all the set, narrowly defined, rigid rules of neoclassicism. They actually had a lot of interest and got a lot of enjoyment from looking at the medieval period. That was a period that, ever since the Renaissance, people had sort of shunned and said, that was the dark past, and we screwed things up during the Middle Ages, and it was barbaric and unenlightened and not worth worrying about. Romantics said, nope, is very much so. A lot of sense of history and a lot of the roots of our current European existence in the 19th century really go back to the Middle Ages. They also were attracted to the colorful and exotic. They got a lot. They began to get interested in Eastern philosophy and Eastern literature and art. So that example of sort of the exotic and the unique and strange and different. And the emphasis on emotion. It's and to our ears and eyes, in the 21st century, it's overwrought emotion, over the top. Sometimes it's just like, really, you're gonna be that overtly, blatantly emotional. Come on, but that's the way they played it, And I'll be sharing with you in a couple minutes some doing some readings from some Romantic literature, and you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about when we do that. Okay, where does this all come from? We said it's a reaction against the Enlightenment, but where did it actually come from? Well, it came from the same kind of roots in some ways as the Second and First Great Awakenings here in the United States came from. The emotional religious revivalism that really started in England with John Wesley and the beginnings of the Methodist Church in England. And that goes way back to the early 18th century. You had different pietist religious sects in Germany that were heavy on an emotional, intuitive understanding of God. Rousseau is a source. Rousseau talked a lot about what people call, he never said this himself, the noble savage, about getting back to nature and the contemplation of nature. And the idea that conscience and intuition should be the true guide of humanity. And we said earlier that Rousseau was a sort of transition figure between the Enlightenment and the Romantic period. Well, there you have it. And they also said human beings are really, really complicated creatures. Human beings are complex. You can't simply explain them through the acts of and the motivations of their rational faculties. The emotion, the intuition, the conscience, those sorts of things are very important as well. So that's our introductory segment on Romanticism. And we'll be back with another segment looking at some particular examples in various countries. See ya.